Good morning. How's everyone feeling this morning? Good. It's good to see you all here at the Wayne State Law School. My name is Peter Blackmer. I've been working with Dorothy, Dewberry, Aldridge to coordinate this symposium today, and I'm really excited for us to all be sharing space today and be engaging in such timely and critical discussions with our movement veterans from Detroit and Selma. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter Hammer, who is the director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, to welcome us into the space before we start today's program.
So good morning, everybody. It's a warm Detroit welcome, and it's a beautiful day outside. But my name's Peter Hammer. I teach here in the law school. I direct the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. I often say at the center, we view that spatial structural racism is our generation's primary civil rights challenge, and a lot of our energy is focused on that. But we also have the Damon J. Keith collection of African-American legal history. So a lot of our work really is steeped in history and honoring the history. And I can't think of a history that's more important than the activism of Detroit and the activism of Selma. And we really are standing on the shoulders of giants. And we're so lucky to have those giants here with us. And I'm so excited just to listen and learn today. So thank you. Welcome to the law school, and turn it back over.
All right, next I'd like to welcome Julie Hamilton from the Viola Liuzzo Park Association, which is the sponsoring organization for today's symposium.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Julie Hamilton. I'm from Viola Liuzzo Park Association. Some of you were at our events in the last couple of days, and we're really grateful for you to come. And we will be having members throughout the day join us from the association. Our main member is the one who's behind an inspiration for a lot of probably what's going on today, and also for Viola Liuzzo Park, and that's Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge. And we could never have done what we have at the park without Dorothy's leadership and wisdom and values. Dorothy is a very value-driven individual, and I know she can probably hear me out there, but she has, I remember the night she walked into the room and introduced herself to us and sat down, and there's a before and there's an after to the wisdom and experience that Dorothy brings, the wealth and depth of her experiences and boldness. So we are very grateful to be here, and Dorothy will be joining us, I think, a little bit later. Thanks so much.
All right, so just to give us a sense of how the day is going to be structured, we're starting with a panel discussion this morning that's focusing on organizing in Selma in the years before Bloody Sunday. And I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment. Then we will break for lunch from 12 to 1. There'll be lunch again in the lobby like there was for breakfast. And then the afternoon, we'll be having a second panel discussion about the importance and significance of writing, teaching, studying movement history. And so I hope y'all will be able to stick around. I'm sure we'll be joined by others as the day goes on. Before we dive in though, I want to just give a word of thanks to our sponsors today for making this program possible. First, of course, the Viola Liuzzo Park Association, and particularly, as Julie mentioned, the work of Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge, who really was the driving force behind the idea and the organization of today's symposium. Also like to thank the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights for making this space available and for making sure that everyone is fed today. So thank you, Peter, for providing the space and the resources to make that happen. Also, I'd like to acknowledge Rise Up Detroit, the Eastern Michigan Department of Africology and African American Studies, Eastern Michigan Center for Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the Wayne State University Crockett-Lumumba Scholars Program for providing resources and support for today's event. Also like to acknowledge Frank Joyce and Marianne Barnett and Linda Cisco for their contributions as well. So with that all said, I would like to introduce our speakers And first, to kind of bring some energy and some spirit into the room, I would like to invite Ms. Bettie Mae Fikes to lead us in song to open up. Bettie Mae Fikes, AKA the voice of Selma, is a celebrated icon of the 1960s civil rights movement, who has since sustained her public activity by frequently performing as a core member of the SNCC Freedom Singers and has graced the stages of Carnegie Hall, the Newport Jazz Festival, and the Library of Congress. She's a recipient of the Long Walk to Freedom Award and has recently been inducted into the Smithsonian Institute's Museum of Tolerance, an exhibition honoring women of the civil rights movement. On March 7th, 2024, she was honored by President Joe Biden at the 2024 State of the Union address. She remains one of only a few living divas who can legitimately lay claim to the title, the Queen of the Blues, and back it up with both a genuine gift for soul music and relevant historical significance. Her message is universal, timely, and timelessly transgenerational. Please join me in welcoming Bettie Mae Fikes.
No, I didn't get this by myself. Well, we can't do anything about it. We can come together. Put sand on the shoulders of me. Many have died for this cause. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom. Now wait. Now this is 2024. I'm telling you about 1964 and 65. People laid their lives down. Now, 1964, 5 or 10 children get together singing. You can hear them all over the community. Here we are today. We can't even hear you in the bathroom. I can't allow you to kill me. Let's do this again. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom. Lord, don't you let nobody turn you around, turn you around. Turn you around, don't you let nobody turn you around. I'm gonna keep on walking. You gotta keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Are we free? Not yet. Can't you act like you're free? Don't you feel, get up in the morning sometime, might not have no money, might not, but you just feel good? You know that spirituality? How many have lost that spirituality? This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you, Betty Mae Fikes. Let's give it up one more time. All right, at this point, I would like to invite our morning speakers to come have a seat at the front table. Y'all were just introduced to Betty Mae Fikes, who will be joining us. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Terry Shaw. Terry Shaw grew up in Selma, Alabama during a time of intense racial tension. In the summer of 1962, despite his parents' initial reluctance, Shaw secretly attended meetings organized by SNCC. Encouraged by Reverend Bernard Lafayette Jr., Shaw became the president of the Dallas County Student Movement, playing a critical role in Selma's civil rights activism. Under Shaw's leadership, the student movement conducted voter registration drives and organized mass meetings. Despite threats from the police and local authorities, Shaw and his fellow activists remained undeterred, continuing their efforts to mobilize the Black community in Selma. The movement faced constant harassment, including threats from the KKK and police brutality. Following the 1963 assassination of JFK, Shaw organized a mass meeting in 1964 at Brown Chapel to keep hope alive in Selma. His defiance, along with that of his classmates, signaled the growing resolve of young activists. The movement's efforts culminated in significant actions, including boycotts and protests that would later contribute to the broader civil rights struggle in Alabama and beyond. Eventually, Shaw moved from Selma to Detroit because of threats to his life. He continues to provide oral history on his time in the movement and in segregated Selma. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Terry Shaw. I would also like to welcome up Ms. Martha Prescod Norman Noonan. Martha Prescod Norman Noonan's journey as a civil rights activist began during her first year at the University of Michigan in 1961, where she met SNCC activists including Curtis Hayes and Tom Hayden. Their commitment to change inspired her deeply, making her realize that young people, like herself, could alter the racial landscape. She quickly became involved raising funds for SNCC and organizing efforts in Detroit. Despite her parents' objections, Noonan volunteered in the South during the summer of 1963, working on SNCC projects in Albany, Greenwood, Mississippi, and Selma, Alabama, where she witnessed the harsh realities of racial violence. Her experiences solidified her dedication to the movement, leading her to work in Selma after graduating in 1964. The empowerment she felt during these years shaped her lifelong interest in history and storytelling, focusing on the courage of Black Southerners in the fight for freedom. Noonan's legacy as a homemaker, community organizer, and chronicler of the civil rights movement remains a testament to her unwavering commitment to justice. She was one of 6 editors of Hands on the Freedom Plow, personal accounts by women in SNCC, which we're going to hear more about this afternoon as well. Please join me in welcoming Martha Prescod Norman Noonan. Can we please bring Betty Mae Fikes back up to the table too? Let's give her one more round of applause. She comes back up. All right. So I have a few questions prepared to get our speakers into conversation, but also want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for y'all to be asking questions, engaging with our speakers. So please, as questions come up, please bank them And there will be time to ask those in just a little while. So to open us up, could each of you please tell us about how you first got involved with the Black Freedom Movement and the kinds of issues that you first started organizing around?
But my first involvement was with like Terry. Bernard Lafayette came to Selma, Alabama. I think that was around 62 or 63. I was a student at R.B. Hudson High School. That afternoon, after school, we were walking from school and we met this young man in a broken down car. I wasn't there, but Cleophas Hobbs and a fellow by the name of Charles Bond. And in the meeting of Bernard, question came up to them if they knew whether or not their parents had the right to vote. That question brought Charles and Cleophas back to us. And that's how we got involved in the movement, because we all went to meet Bernard Lafayette as children. And he was telling us the things of segregation that we wasn't even aware of. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what it was. But with young people like Bernard Lafayette, this young lady here, coming to Selma, we found out that we were in a segregated city, living there for half of a lifetime and not knowing the things that was happening all around us. That was my involvement of getting into this movement, hopefully to make a change.
Well, I met Bernard probably about 2 or 3 months later. But I was with my friends. We had this one little cafe called the Savoy's Cafe, and it was on Lapsy Street. And we seen this strange black guy walking down the street talking to people. And the three of us were standing in front of Savoy's Cafe. And when he got close enough for us to hear his voice, it was different because I'm in the 11th grade at R.B. Hudson High School. I hadn't heard a black guy talk like a white guy, but sound better than a white guy. And we couldn't figure out who he were. So we asked him, "Hey man, where you from?" And he said something real strange. He said, "I'm from the North." And we couldn't understand. Why would you be from the North, down here in front of Savoy's Cafe, talking to 3 black guys that sitting up here trying to figure out how we're gonna get enough money to buy a Coke and a bologna sandwich? But he talked to us. And then one thing that stuck out, something similar to what Bettie said, well, what do you guys do after school? Where you go? So I say, well, after school, Bob got to go home because Mr. Moe have us cutting wood to put on the back of the truck and sell. And then after that, we might get 10 cents a piece. And then we come up here and stand in front of Savoy's and just have fun. And then he started telling us some places we could go. And then we looked at him and we said this thing that we always say to each other: "Nigga, you crazy. I ain't going across Broad Street. Man, you know the white folks kill us up there. We can't go up on Broad Street." They said, "The only time you go across Broad Street is you go across Broad Street to go to Range Street and to go to the black neighborhood." I said, "But downtown on Broad Street, we don't go down there." So we go to Washington Street. He said, oh, no. He said, you supposed to go anywhere you want to. And the other two guys said, man, we finna go home. And I said, okay. And so he said, where you stay? I said, I stay across the street. And he started walking back across the street because the Freedom House was a block behind mine. And it was on First Avenue. And I started talking, and he carried me to Tabernacle Baptist Church. Matter of fact, before we went to Tabernacle, I talked to his wife, and it was real strange to hear two black people sound like white folks, but they was black. And they started telling us what we have to offer and stuff like that. And so I started listening, and I followed him around a while. And then that's when we hooked up, and I don't want to hold you a long time, but we hooked up this thing where it was sort of odd because Pa's father was a minister light. Charles worked across the street for a white dude, and he had to go to black people and collect their money for the white dude while he sat in the car, and he worked in the cleaners. Bettie got out school at lunchtime, and she go do hair. I stayed in school all day trying to figure out what is going on with this world. And I really figured it out one day when we was all in the basement of Tabernacle Baptist Church, and they was telling us, I don't want to get emotional, they was telling us that we can go out and tell people to vote and make things better. And we was excited about it, Betty. We was real excited until they told us, and now when you go to the place and sit down at the counter, just sit there. And we said, but they're gonna beat it, but that's okay. And that was the hardest part. That was the hardest part, to know that what we was doing gonna get us beat.
Yeah.
That was the hardest part. But the most hardest thing that I think from the time I met them were, I didn't get so much scared of white peoples. I got scared of the black peoples that was scared of the white peoples because we was talking to them. That's how I got started.
Well, you kind of covered my, I got interested in the civil rights movement. Well, first of all, in my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, and when I was in high school, there was a sympathy picket for Woolworth when I went downtown, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And somehow I knew I wasn't supposed to cross the picket line. And then I saw a white paper about the Nashville student movement, and I wanted to go to Fisk. However, my mother was a Michigan alumna, and that was not in the cards. And as Peter mentioned, when I went to campus at University of Michigan in 1961, some students came up from Macomb, Mississippi. And later that year, Tom Hayden came back from Albany, Georgia. He'd been arrested in a freedom ride. So it was exactly the first impetus was that people my age were doing something about racism. And I had experienced enough racism in Providence to be interested. My parents, my parents moved into a white neighborhood when my father was losing his sight. And they wanted to get a bigger house so that they could rent the upstairs to compensate for the loss of income. And this was really, this is a regular old neighborhood. Most of the people in that neighborhood's parents spoke, were non-English. It was an immigrant neighborhood. And they were not happy to have us there. The image that I remember of my parents, because they didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that people were throwing stones through the window and stuff like that. We had company one night and, a rock came through the window. Nobody said anything, the people who were there. My father got up, he went downstairs. He kept plywood in the basement for these occasions, put the plywood up on the window, and they continued their evening. I was taunted on the way to school. I was the only Black child for a while. And then another young Black girl went to school with me. And I had the same experience when I received a scholarship to a private school, where, there was no encouragement. There was a lot of discouragement, and unkind comments and so forth. So then I get to college. I'm sure I'm going to be far away from the civil rights movement, and it comes to Michigan, to University of Michigan. And in the spring of 1962, I went to an SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and a SNCC conference in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And Miss Ella Baker spoke at this conference. And in between sessions, and these sessions, I can't even, there were maybe 30 people at this conference, 35 people. And I would say they were the skeleton for the peace movement and the civil rights workers. And Miss Baker spoke, and people who were already working for SNCC. So that the different projects were giving reports. And so the report was as much singing as it was repeating what was going on in the conference. But they talked about Miss Baker's vision. And it was a vision of a South-wide movement based in the Southern Black Belt, where, of course, in most of the counties, there were more Black people living in these counties than white. And of course, there was this possibility for the vote. But she saw a much greater possibility. And her concept, as it was explained to me by the workers and what I heard from her, was that we as civil rights workers were not to think of ourselves in any way as leaders. We were to be catalysts by bringing people together. And if we brought people together in the Black Belt, they would address what it is they wanted to be done. This is your basic grassroots community organizing. And by definition, what they would want would be radical and would radicalize not just the South, but by definition would radicalize the country. And of course, there was, again, the political issue that Congress, the main committees in Congress were headed by white Southern congressmen who were holding back any kind of liberal legislation. So there was a tremendous political possibilities. But they were talking about possibilities that went way beyond the vote. We're talking about the possibility of uniting these groups and associations all across the Black Belt for whatever purposes that people decided they wanted to do, economic, social, and so forth. And that really grabbed me. Like, here was a possibility for huge, radical, social change.
Thank you. Oh, I'll jump
I
back in.
forgot the Detroit connection. So in the summer of, and this is where we're all the same, in the summer, so then SNCC started doing fundraising, and in the summer of 1962, Bernard Lafayette came to Detroit to start a Friends of SNCC group. And so there is the connection between Detroit and Selma started that early. And again, I want to say what we did in these Friends of SNCC groups was a variety of things, because one of the first things was getting the word out. And so Bernard organized a mass meeting here in Detroit with Diane Nash as the main speaker. And her theme was, she was pregnant at the time. In fact, she left here in labor. And her theme was, she was under indictment in Mississippi, and she said, and you know, my baby will be born in jail, but any Black child who's born in Mississippi is already in jail. You know, that was the kind of theme. So we did a lot to get the word out. We did various kinds of support work, food drives. We brought the Freedom Singers both to Ann Arbor and Detroit. And that started really almost a lifelong Friends of SNCC work that both Dorothy and I joke we're still involved in today.
Thank you, Pat. So to kind of build on what y'all have shared so far, I would love to hear from Betty Mae Fikes and Terry Shaw about what that was like having SNCC come into Selma and some of the other national civil rights organizations come in, and what some of those dynamics were like and what you all were up to and working on at that time.
Well, it's funny, like Terry said, as children, it was the first time I had seen, like Terry, so many intelligent young Black men and women coming to Selma, telling us things that we hadn't even been taught in school. I didn't know that my parents didn't have the right to vote. But all of this was brought to us by young men and women that was, I don't think nobody was even 30 years old. Intelligent. So sitting there and listening, Bernard was the first, but there were so many afterwards. We became a family. I started out passing out leaflets through the community. But mind you, I didn't know that it was going to be a struggle. And it's funny when I tell people when I'm being interviewed, cut your tape off, because I got in the movement to keep from going to church so much. I had to go to church every day, practically. I come from a long line of preachers, deacons, and good gospel singers. And there was always something to do at church or in the community. So I was already established in working in the community and was already known in the community by family. But getting the word out and going to places that I had lived in Selma practically not all my life, but part of my life, and going out in the rural areas after we done started passing out leaflets. Then the mass meeting starts. But would you believe that we had to fight the blacks just as hard as we had to fight the whites? When you're trying to get something started and you go into a restaurant or pass by and here's one of your mother's friends say, y'all need to get out of here. You're embarrassing us. You're gonna get us in trouble. So for a while, it was confusion. And as far as I'm concerned, today, 60 years later, I'm still in a state of confusion. When I look at you today, look how far we have come. But this place should be packed. These are the things that get me today from yesterday. Yesterday, even though to come out, we put our life in danger. For this thing you call freedom. And I tell everybody, every nationality that come to this country, bring their heritage and culture with them, and they pass it on from generation to generation. We haven't passed on Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. These were people I had never heard of in school that had laid the foundation for me. No teacher had taught me that. The only person that we were taught in school was Booker T. Washington. The only person that in history that a teacher could tell us about was Booker T. Washington. But in Selma, just for schools, we couldn't even get new books. We had to go into Tillman's basement and get books that kids, white kids had at Parish High. Some of the pages had been torn out, all written up in the books. I didn't understand that. But what I did try to understand was my grandmother kept telling me, don't worry, everything's gonna be all right. How? Still asking that question today. How? When we're still so divided. How can we make a change today? In the 60s, Bloody Sunday. But before Bloody Sunday, going through the communities, most people in Selma think they know me, but they don't know me. Why? Because I traveled. My mother was a gospel singer, and she always went from Birmingham to Selma. And when she went to Birmingham to work, I lived in Selma with my grandmother. My mother died 1957 at the age of 32, and I was 10. So I traveled to LA, already going through changes in my mind as a gospel singer with my mother, not even 9 or 10 years old, going to rural areas, wondering why the blacks live like this and the whites live so much better. Not understanding. And today, when I pass, a lot of us have arrived. But what's the point? We arrived in so many ways, but we lost so much along the way. So when I come to speak anywhere, the things that I talk about are things that I had sealed so tightly that I never wanted to revisit again. To see torture of old people. My grandmother was a slave, but she never talked about it. Now here I am, I followed a movement nearly about 60 years next year. And I just started talking about it. Who wants to talk about trauma and pain? Who wants to talk about who had to die for you to get here? then when you arrive, you don't have sense enough to appreciate the one that died for you. So I tell everybody, I'm for real, because the first one that died for me and shed the blood was the one above. That I was so pissed off with him. You done took my mama and left me with all these crazy people. Everything I learned by watching others. I was raised by a grandmother, didn't sit down and tell us about things because her things was in the past. Here, her granddaughter is now the future. So they tried to protect me from all the harm that was outside. How? Eventually, I got involved. But if anyone had told me, and I wonder today how my life would have been if it had not been for the movement. Because once I got in, I got committed. I didn't think we were going to have any problems. We just passing out leaflets. And when I tell you a mass meeting is something you can never describe in Selma, Alabama in the 60s. If I could get that again, if I could get people involved like that again, bringing all together in unity as one. As a matter of fact, we used to say Selma was like the biblical times when Moses led the people out of Egypt. That's the way it was. But honey, those mass meetings, way before King came to Selma.
Yeah.
You would think you were in heaven. That there's no problem outside of this door. You hear them old grandmamas up there, oh Lord, have mercy. Don't do that anymore. We don't do that. I wondered for a lifetime, how could people be so happy with nothing? And here we are with some of the most valuable things in the world now and can afford them. But look where we are. Oh, my people. Oh, my people. My grandmother used to always tell me, gal, you know you ask too many questions. And it's going to get you in trouble. And believe me, it does. But I wanted to know. But when she told me one day, some things are better not known. For instance, when they bombed the Birmingham Church, 16th Street Baptist Church, that particular Sunday morning, everybody in Selma practically getting ready for church. How did the news get to Selma so fast when there were no cell phones? And I knew then that my grandmother was going to tell me, Bettie, it's getting too dangerous. I walked by her bedroom door over and over again, waiting for her to call me in. And there was not a word. And eventually I heard her, I knew I was in trouble. When I did get called in, she said, Bettie, it's getting rough, but God is with you. God is with you. So from that day, 16th Street church bombing, that's when I found out they can kill us like this and nothing can be done. And here we are still fighting against each other. So I just stopped then and got like grandmama, and I'm like grandmama today. Thank you.
Mr. Shaw, I was wondering if you could pick up on some of the things that Ms. Fikes just mentioned, particularly in the context of how you all dealt with that level of violence and repression and sustained yourselves to keep fighting.
Well, it was more twofold because once we had our little, what we call class session of not what to do when you get hit upside the head, how to talk to the peoples, to be careful, you know, where you go, who you with. That was, I call, the easy part. The hard part were, like if you remember when I first started out, to have peoples that you've been knowing for a long time find out that you're talking to these peoples that are running around with these leaflets, telling peoples to go down to the courthouse to vote. And you don't know nothing about that, you too young to do that, you shouldn't be doing that. After they found out that I was doing that, my two buddies that used to stand in front of the Theoharis with me got a good understanding that they didn't deal with me no more. And so you end up losing the peoples that you knew real close because their parents were so scared that something's gonna happen to you. So that's why when you look at it, we see what the Ku Klux Klansmen can do. Ku Klux Klansmen wasn't a problem because I guess the only, I said, show tell thing that the Ku Klux used to do, but they'll let you know they're coming so you can get prepared to hide. You know, they're gonna blow their horn and they're gonna have the lights on and all that. So you ain't gonna just sit there and wait on them, you understand? But with your neighbors, your peoples that you used to go to the store for, start closing the door when they see you coming. We had, I'll give you an example. My mother worked for this white woman, and her husband's last name was Pope. She worked at a clinic, that this doctor's office, where it was a big office, bigger than this, but we had the part by half of this. She worked in the back part. She gave black people shots. She took care of a whole lot of black people. But her husband was a Ku Klux, and he was up in it. And it was strange because my mom had to walk about 3 miles from where she worked at home. And this was a white man, had a big old dog. They used to bark and bite everybody. But that dog used to walk home with my mom every day. And when she get home, he'll come on the porch, I'll pet him, and wouldn't be nothing said. But I made a mistake one day, and I came home, and the dog followed me down to the Freedom Office. And I found something out. And, you know, just the way I feel. Your friends, the most racist peoples that I found out was my black neighbors, my teachers, and black peoples in general. And it was sad. And it bothered me all the way up to today. But this dog went all the way downtown with me. The next day my mama came home, she had never said nothing about me participate or nothing. She never said, don't go down there. She never said that. Only someone she told, well, my sister, she'll say, you go see, is he okay? And that's it. But that dog showed me something. For a day, the white man tied that dog up. He wouldn't let him loose. That dog broke loose and came down to my house with my mom, and the man tried to get him back, and he growled at him. And I looked, she told me about that, and I looked at it, and I thought about it. I said, here's a dog that don't suppose to have more sense than I have. But he can see something that we hadn't seen in a long time. If you step out of your comfort zone, I say comfort zone because I'm talking to you guys. But if you step out of the place that you're supposed to be, you'll be surprised who will turn their back on you. I give you, when they had the bombing, when President Kennedy was killed, I was in the third period class. A young man in Selma had just came down there. He had came out to Bernard, out to John Love, out to Tucker, out to Reverend Brown. This young man came and he sent a young man to the school to tell me to bring the students to the church because we were gonna have a mass meeting. We called for the president there. So he came down the hill and told me. I went back up the hill, and if I'm not mistaken, I stopped by what we call the brick mason class and told a little short guy named Cleophas Hobbs. I say, Hobbs, I said, Silas said, bring all the kids to the church, to Brown Chapel. He said, okay. He said, I'll take the top floor, you take the bottom floor. I said, okay. And that's what we did. We went from class to class to class, telling the kids we're gonna have a mass meeting at Brown Chapel Church. And all of the students came out. And when we got to the door of the school, the superintendent of school, chief of police, the principal, the vice principal, and no disrespect, we had this one little guy that had two walkers. I'm walking on one now. I think he made me do this. But he got two walkers, and he was there telling us how, if we even think about leaving the school, what was gonna happen to us.
Yeah.
He was, I mean, and the principal, woo. This principal, oh my God. And they were saying all of this, and they were just talking and telling us what was gonna happen if we leave school and all that stuff. And then he said, now turn around. And I said, Mr. Yelder, he looked at me. I said, excuse me. And I walked out the door. And when I walked out the door, the school was empty. I didn't ever make it to Brown Chapel because by the time I got to First Avenue, my favorite friend had grabbed me and put me in the back of his police car. But racism is something that we have to really be aware of. And this is my thing on what this movement have done for me. What it did for me was to learn me, you don't have to be a white man and hate me. You could be a black man and hate me more for what I'm doing right. And I have got to the point where I don't look at a skin color. I look at the individual action. The way you treat me, let me know whether or not you okay with me doing whatever I'm doing. And I can say this. I found out that if you don't stop, that same person that will whoop peoples and beat them will make it their business to be your friend, but they'll still keep you in jail all the time. And I'm gonna tell you, I have been in the jail in Selma so often that when we have a match meeting at the church, I was, you know how you said, slipping in the back door? I slip in the back door to go to the meeting, I slip in the back door to go home. Because if I come out the front, the sheriff gonna come across the street, walk up on the steps, and grab me like I'm his friend and put me in the back of the car and put me in jail. And we have to understand that we cannot do this and then stop and think it's gonna be okay. I understand, and I'm not trying to put nobody down or nothing, but sit down and think about it. Everybody's in here ain't going back to high school no more. We done did about made where we're gonna be at. So what's gonna happen when we die out? Who's gonna pick up the baton? We can't do it unless we tell somebody. And we can't tell the older peoples, because when I was coming up, the older peoples didn't tell me. Young peoples told me. Young peoples. We need to have young peoples to tell us, tell me where I am and why you did what you did, and so how can I do it where I don't have to worry about it later on? We need us to tell us. And just like Betty said, I don't know about nobody else in here, but if you ever had a history book and had to get it from a white person, you will even know who B.B. King is.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Ms. Noonan, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more to build on what you said, kind of coming out of that Chapel Hill conference, that the directive was not to be leaders, but to be catalysts. And we were hearing Mr. Shaw talk about some of the challenges of organizing, some of the opposition within communities. So I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about how you approach that work of grassroots organizing coming into Selma.
I just want to make one thing clear about Terry coming to Detroit. It wasn't like, oh, one day I think I'd like to live in Detroit. I mean, he came under dark. You had to leave Selma in the dark. And he had to leave Selma for fear of his life. And, you know, then come to Detroit. Well, by the time I got to Selma, I didn't come until beginning of 65. So all this groundwork had been laid, and we were divided. Selma was divided into wards, and I worked in the 5th ward, and in a way it was fairly day-to-day work, canvassing, having meetings. In my ward, the things that people were concerned about, it was getting a traffic light at a dangerous corner. It was getting employed at Dan River Mills. Yeah. It was Dan River Mills. It was doing some union organizing. So it was a variety of different things, and you just basically you held a meeting, and bringing people together, you would just say, well, what are we going to do? And that was the basis of it. I want to emphasize a little bit about how mean, I think Terry has touched on this. The Alabama police were mean. They intended to torture people. I mean, you see it with the fire hoses, of course, starting in Birmingham. And Bloody Sunday was just the last of many such attacks on civil rights workers. There was a demonstration in Gadsden early on where they made the students take off their shoes and run in their bare feet. The story that my ex-husband used to tell, which I think summed it up, on his first demonstration in Selma. You know, when you went on a demonstration, you're supposed to take a toothbrush, for obvious reasons, and a dime so that you couldn't be arrested as a vagrant. So he was busy getting his toothbrush and his dime and his overalls. And the policeman said to him, "You aren't going to need those today." And he's thinking, "Oh, okay, well, we're not going to get arrested." And then the policeman said to him, "We're just going to beat the shit out of you." And that's what they did. When University of Michigan students came down to Montgomery to support the Tuskegee students, the police in Montgomery were on horseback and they had batons long enough to stay on horseback and beat the students as they went through. They would ride through the crowd in a figure 8. So it's this meanness, and in contrast, when you do nonviolent direct action, you have nothing to hide behind. The Klan had sheets, but when someone stepped out to a demonstration or tried to register to vote or decided to go to the Thirsty Boy, they got cattle prodded. That was the other little torture, cattle prod. Everybody knew you had done this. It's a small town. Your parents were punished. It's a very brave action. And I think the kinds of things that were done, and I wanted to connect this brutality also to the killings. And it's so important, the work that you guys are doing with Mrs. Liuzzo and the other people who were killed in 1965. And of course, there are people after that. We have to remember these people, not just they should be honored. They should be recognized in this annual celebration of Bloody Sunday. There should be more sorrow, more emphasis, because you don't really understand what it was people were facing, how brave they were, and how, and I think this is something, this isn't like everybody stepping out. These are small numbers of people in the beginning stepping out against the strongest white power terrorist system in the country. And that aspect needs to be emphasized in the remembrance of these martyrs so that you understand what the civil rights movement was about. Otherwise, it's kind of like, okay, so there was a little beating there on Bloody Sunday, and a Voting Rights Act was passed, and all is well. We have no sense of what it took to get from 1962 to 1965.
Just one more. What people fail to realize, the healing from bloody Sunday is not complete because there's so many people that still hurting.
Yes.
We forget, the young people that knew Miss Viola used to call her Mrs. B because it was short. But it was a young man with her named Leroy Moulton. I'm sorry. It was a young man with her named Leroy Moulton. And don't you know that from 1965 to sometime last year, he was still running. He was still running. You know, when people that knew him, he was supposed to have been in Connecticut. I know a couple people say, "Hey, Leroy," and he just took off. We are still hurting. People are still hurting. So we need to make sure, just like they do for boys that go off to war and come back, we need to understand it's a whole lot of peoples from Bloody Sunday, from the Birmingham March, from the bombing in the church. It's still peoples that need healing. They cannot get healing if we don't start acting like we still in 1962. Because we not through yet. But if we sit up and say, "Oh, I can go vote, everything is okay," it's gonna be gone. We still need to keep the fight going. Thank you.
How many of y'all in the audience have questions that you would like to pose to our speakers? Got a couple. Okay, I'll ask one more and then I'm going to open it up for y'all to ask those. We kind of just arrived at this question that I was hoping that we would get to, and y'all have spoken to it a little bit, but acknowledging what y'all have shared about that Selma was bigger than just the Selma to Montgomery March. It was bigger and it was more complex than just Dr. King being there. And y'all have mentioned a lot of local people and organizers that were part of the movement whose names we don't recognize or hold in the same kind of light. And so I was hoping that we could speak a little bit about what y'all see as some of the lasting legacies, the lessons, the impacts of the movement in Selma, and who some of the unsung heroes of that movement were that we really need to be uplifting.
I just want to make a little point. Dr. King was in Selma maybe a total of 3 days. I mean, he was.
The movement was already set when
Right.
King got to Selma.
Yeah.
By the children. But they wrote us out of history. Some of the things you need to know. I do the things I do today, not for myself, but for the unsung heroes. Because I'm grateful for the people that laid their lives down, that I could have a right. I wish you all knew what it was like then. Not about the brutality, but about the spirituality. That's what kept the movement. And it was people like Worthlong that I love dearly today. Silas Norman, Tom Brown, John Lewis. And may I say another thing, that the young soldiers, just what my brother was speaking on. 10 years ago, I became aware of this movement, of the people of the movement. a lot of people thought it was all over. But I have brothers and sisters that participated wholeheartedly, and they become like Vietnam veterans. When Terry just said, they're broken. Cleophas died broken. He tried everything he could to reenact another movement in Selma. Couldn't get the blacks out. He opened a photography program. Parents wouldn't bring the children. These are the suffering of the states that the movement was in. As a matter of fact, you can see the suffering. All you have to go and visit, and you don't have to go turn on television. Selma, Alabama now is the shrinkingest city in the South. I'm sure a lot of y'all have been there to tour, but you're only there for a moment. You don't see what's behind the curtains. And no one tells you the true story. You go for a story that happened 50 years ago. But now, another set of people have taken over. Another generation. And when I say looking like today, most of you here today know exactly what happened. Not everything, but some of the things that happened 60 years ago. So my legacy is to the people that laid this foundation. As Martha said, when King got to Selma, Selma was already on the move. We had 8 men from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Mr. Doyle, Mr. Turner, all these men, just 8 men, the 8 courageous men that had been fighting silently for freedom. And one of them went to Montgomery to bring King to Selma. So the story of Selma has never really been told. And that's what's so frightening to me today, because our frontliners have all gone. Who's going to tell the stories? Our stories now are being researched. Somebody else's story as history. History is just another man's story. We got to get this right. Legacy of forgotten men. Willie C. was the first one to get initiated. That's what we called it. Sitting at counter drugs. He went in and counted drugs and asked Mr. Carter, rather, why is it I can come up here and buy your merchandise, but I can't sit at your counter and order a hamburger and a Coke? So he sat at the counter. We were protesting that day. Mr. Carter asked him to move because they wasn't going to serve him. He didn't move. So he took a billy club and cracked his skull. That was my first time seeing that happen and to see blood. Now, is this something you want to get in, girl? You better think about it. So, this was my beginning of what I was getting ready to get into. This is the reason why I still do what I do today. Not for myself, but for the ones who laid this foundation for me. And it goes on and on and on. Who's going to tell the stories? This is my story. What will your story be? I asked you that today. And I challenge each and every one of you here today to go to your communities. Because where I am today, as my children say, Be careful. My mother has pent-up frustrations from the 60s. She's no joke. And I do have pent-up frustration. Because what makes me cry more is that I had sealed all of this so tightly that I never wanted to revisit. My stories have never been told because it's hurtful and it's pain. To hear stories where a sister's beaten so badly that you could hear the licks all the way down the hallway. Well, a young brother by the name of Joe T. Smitherman. Our mayor was named Joe T. Smitherman. Exactly. When Joe T. Smitherman was arrested, they asked his name. Joe T. Smitherman. What you say, boy? Joe T. Smitherman. Bio. Beaten because he had the same name as the mayor. How do you suppress problems? How do you suppress death? How do you suppress pain? Tossing and turning. 50 years later, and it's worse now because I'm getting ready to revisit the 60th. And it's already problems starting among the Blacks. When is it going to stop? 60 years later. When are we going to start building rather than tearing down? When are we going to stand up rather than to just stand up to be a part rather than to stand up to be honored? We got to stop. In the meantime, I just keep on moaning. Thank you.
I'd like to speak to that before we open it up.
I had maybe 3 quick points I want to make. And I'm sure everybody on the committee knows that Leroy Moton was not just in the car with Viola Liuzzo, but he was there after she was shot. And so he was lying basically under her
Play dead.
and had to play dead because the Klansmen came back to the car to check, to make sure that she was gone. So he, and then he had to get home.
Walk
Mm-hmm.
back across the bridge.
Highway 80.
He was about 3 miles between Lowndes County
Mm-hmm.
and Dallas, where Selma. He had to walk back across the bridge at like 35 miles, 25 miles. But the part that people don't understand, he didn't only just walk back across the bridge. When he finished walking, he wasn't even in the South anymore. I didn't know how he got where he was.
Mm-mm.
But that's what, when you say, let's don't stop, not taking away anything. Let's build every monument we have, but let's let people know the foundation of which it came. If we do that, then we can do better than what we doing now.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you go to Selma, the bridge crossing, see all of the little setup that they have on the street. It's from vendors that doesn't even live in Alabama. People's in Alabama. Well, not the people's. The people's in Selma is not invited to the bridge crossing. We had a city in Selma, it's Lowndes County. Lowndes County still, in other words, Flint don't have nothing on Lowndes County.
That's true.
They still don't have a sewer system.
Mm-mm.
But they have an anniversary for the president and everybody to go to the foot of Ever Pedersen Bridge.
The famous bridge.
That's mine.
I want to make the point too, the SNCC office, which was upstairs, in the black part of downtown was directly across from the jail and City Hall. So that was a very interesting situation.
Yes.
Clark would wave at us and say hello. And Terry, he would just arrest Terry. But it was.
He knew Terry personally.
Yeah, you were right there with him. Is a point I want to make.
Microphone towards you.
Oh. Is that good? Yeah. The other thing is, you know, on one hand, all these things seem like nothing was happening, but on the other hand, everything was happening. Because every little or big gesture was an attack on the white power system. And part of what happened is it showed the weakness of that system. If 5 high school students could upset the city, they had won. That was a victory. I think the other thing was if 10 people went to jail, that was something taken out of the arsenal of the white supremacists. That was the fear of jail. If someone kept being active, even though his mother had to keep moving because no one would rent to her, again, you're destroying the power of white supremacy. And you really are attacking terrorism, because that was the bottom line. And if you continue to act in the face of terrorism, the terrorism is destroyed. And I want to point out also that every house I canvassed had a gun above the fireplace for hunting. And there were places that the police and so forth there were neighborhoods they knew better than to go into, and areas. One lasting thing I want to think of that happened in Selma. SNCC brought Malcolm X to Selma. And he, in Selma, pledged support for the civil rights movement and the need for unity. And I think that was one of the crowning blows leading to his death. It was 3 weeks later after he was there.
But he said while he was in the speech, one thing, I don't remember the whole speech, sitting in the audience, but I remember him saying, you put your Bible in one hand and you put your gun in the other. I still remember that today. My Bible is in this hand and my gun is in Thank you.
Yes. Ooh, okay. Want to give a shout out to the official. I want to give a shout out to our official historian of the city of Detroit, Jeanne Jordan. This is good feedback. I know you can project. Thank you. Story, but it's politics. So I don't know anybody who probably not moved and learn something today from just the really few minutes we have. I have a question. My question is, there's a lot going on in this pre-1965,
Bloody Sunday, pre-Martin Luther King Jr. showing up in Selma. A lot going on. So you got Bernard Lafayette coming in 62, and then in 63, he's beaten almost to death. That's the same day that Medgar Evers was assassinated in Mississippi. And then King is in jail in Birmingham. And writing the letter from a Birmingham jail. All this stuff is happening really at the same time in different places. When you were in Selma, being active, being turned away by the Black folks and being arrested and beat up by white folks, did you see yourself as part of this larger movement, or did you see yourself as part of just what was going on in Selma? Did you see yourself as part of even a Southern Pride movement or a national civil rights movement, or did you see yourself as fighting for what was going on in Selma?
Well, I saw myself fighting what was going on at the time. I had not a clue that we were making history. And I didn't have a clue that I was poor. Because like I said, I was raised by a family that believed so highly in God that, you know, everything was possible. And you wasn't supposed to question God. So what I was doing, I didn't think it was right. What's right about a child being down in the basement with Bernard Lafayette, being taught how to protect themselves in case of violence? Ball yourself up in a fetus position. You got to prepare yourself for a killing. I didn't understand that. But I participated in that because I had seen a difference. My mother was a gospel singer, as I said, so I traveled, even though it was the South, rural areas, Birmingham, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa. Everywhere I went, I saw a difference. But the same thing over and over again with the Blacks. Black counters, colored, white. Water fountain, colored, white. And it was so stupid that the fountains were so close together that when you bend, if two of you lay together, you're gonna be right in each other's face. Stupid. The theater, the Blacks could only sit upstairs, the white downstairs. And with naive kids, we could throw ice, popcorn. So did I think I was creating something? No, I thought I was making things better for Selma. But Selma castrated me. So now here we are. In the 60s, we had 3 theaters and 2 drive-ins. Today, that's not a movie theater. You can hardly, is there a restaurant now? Everything's gone. So yes, I thought I was laying my life on the line for the Selma people that I love. But my lifestyle showed them that I wasn't doing the right thing. So I became an outcast up until later when all this came out and it was correct. Now, oh, I'm so proud of you. Oh, girl, I'm so,
I don't, you know, there's foresight to say now what I was thinking then, but to put it in perspective, the little thing that I did see change made me feel better at that time. I knew that when we first started marching, so many people didn't like us. After a while, when we had 3 or 4, well, I'll give you an example. When we first started, we couldn't go nowhere but First Avenue Baptist Church. After a while, the people at First Avenue and the city got on Reverend Anderson so hard that we couldn't use his church, so they gave us another one. And it wasn't Brown Street, it was Green Street. It was the one before you get to Brown Street. But when you sit down and look at how, I can use Martha words since she said that, how that white sympathetic races work, we had a big fundraising that people sent clothes to the church. And they was all there, you know, and they was doing a good thing for the people of Selma. They gave them clothes, clothes that they had sent from, I say Goodwill somewhere, you know. But then I realized something, that God got away.
Mhm.
And since they put all that stuff there, and when they put that there, the movement sort of like slowed up because people thought that they had did something and they was getting something better. But then God stepped in and sent a tornado through there. And you know what it hit? It hit that church and tore it up. And then we had to go get another church. And once we got another church, then the movement started again. But what I'm saying is, if I had thought that the little things that I was doing would really make a difference, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd probably be like the ones, and please don't feel bad about me because this is just the way I am. I would be just like the ones that's in Selma now, thinking that they did something and haven't did anything. Because if you, and I'm not down in Selma, I'm down in the system that let them think that they got it made. If you go to Selma now, you will never hear Cleophas Hobbs' name ring out. You'll never hear Silas Norman name ring out. You will never hear Reverend Brown name ring out. And if by all means, you wouldn't hear two people say anything about Worth, not two. But you will hear the principal that try to stop us from leaving. You'll hear about the science teacher that's supposed to be so famous at Selma now. You see what I'm saying? You'll hear about that. For 3 years, from 62 to 65, students was getting whooped, sent into camps and everything. Then, when we made progress, the school teachers decided that it's okay if we go down there and vote. Y'all ain't no beat us? Yeah, come on down. And then they called Dr. King, and I stopped.
Well, I was a student. And as I said, I went to this conference in 62. So, and I was a history major. And the more that I was involved with Friends of SNCC, really, the more I became interested in history. But we did know what was going on everywhere. There was a Watts line in Atlanta, so news spread pretty quickly, and we were keeping track. And to me, there was a sense that there was this rare historical opportunity to make change. SNCC's second chairman, Chuck McDew, one of his repeated lines was, "We're going to see more progress in the next 5 years than we've seen in the last 50. So it was this sense that waging a struggle on these terms might lead to broad change everywhere. And that was part of the idea of having projects in more than one area, that there would be something going on all the time, every day, so that change could be made. Yeah.
I think we got time for one more. Well, y'all mind if we do two more questions? We got started a little bit late. Okay? All right. Mr. Noonan and then Nakia.
I gotta tell a good story.
I'm a driver.
They done learn. Yeah. Well, I want to say one thing. So, at a King event, some years back, my ex-husband was still alive, and you all know, if you're in Detroit, everybody knows Silas. So I'm thinking when it was my time to speak, what am I gonna say? And so my intention was to say something along the lines of, my ex-husband is here, my current husband is here, and the people united will never be divided or something. I had this all planned, but I was so nervous. Somehow it didn't come out right. And I said, I have a husband over there, and I'm introducing my husband over there and my husband over here. And Silas said, this little kid in front of him turned to his mother and said, "That's not right." Oh, God. I think the one thing, at least in my case, that made me a little more acceptable was like Bettie. I grew up in church. My father was a lay minister. My mother played the organ sometimes, and she would play for another church, and their theory was that you couldn't just go to church on Sunday. You had to go at least one other time during the week, and they went 2 and 3 times. So I knew that language. And I think that helped a lot. And people made fun of, I had a strong Providence, he's from Providence. I had a strong Providence accent people just made fun of it, but they were nice. And the other thing, we were taken care of. When we went to these areas, we were taken care of. Bettie made sure I didn't look too bad, People fed us. It was, well, I don't know how to explain it. Even the SCLC staff that was in Selma, they were like our friends. It was, that film is horrible. But we're all there together. So the higher ups weren't there.
No.
They would come in for whatever. But
Special occasion.
James Orange, I'm
Yeah.
thinking,
But see, that was the thing
James
that people,
Orange.
people don't understand. They pick our organization and not the people's. the SNCC was there 3 years before SCLC came in. And when SCLC came in, it wasn't a dividing, it was more help. James Orange,
Yeah.
Willie Tabb and Terry
Yeah.
Shaw and John Bett, I think it was.
Yeah.
We was in Marion. See, the four of us, we had 2 SNCCs and 2 SCLC working in Marion, Alabama. You know, the night that all this went off. We wasn't divided. Matter of fact, James Orange, me, and Tab, we stayed at the house with a lady. You know, Joy stayed at the house with Orange. And it wasn't you know, we had to do this because we were SNCC, and you did this because you was SCLC. It was just one organization, 2 names.
All working the same cause.
Yes.
And Alan, when people came to town, I don't know how they went to houses, to come to the communities, to the Freedom Office, and you meet people for the first time and you take them in your home. But the first, as we call the Freedom Riders that came to our home, when they found out that my aunt was allowing them to stay, they cut the lights off. So things like that happen, but that's how we all became a big family. Meeting for the first time, everybody's fighting for the same cause, and we sit up all night strategy on what we're going to do for the next day until it got so bad we would start saying, this may be my last time. So we just came together. And when I talk about the Blacks, I went to Camden and wanted to help out there, and I went to the school. And I worked at the school for 2 days. Black people now. 2 days later, they closed the school. Not the white people, the Black people. We don't know what that girl's up to. So people were afraid and fearful. And the most important things were afraid to trust. Pretty much the same today with the older generation in Selma. So we met each other for the first time, and we became a blood family because we was fighting the same fight. After when I heard Medgar Evers, that was the first death that I heard as a kid with the fight that he was doing. That's what pulled me in. I hadn't heard of King, but I heard of Medgar Evers. So things like that, when I say you suppress so dearly and tightly, those memories you hold on so tightly that I never want to expose them again. It's hurtful, it's painful, but it's very real.
Got one more question, and Mr. Shaw asked the question earlier, who's gonna pick up the baton in this younger generation? And so I want to shout out to Nakia Wallace, who's one of those people who's picked up the baton, and give you the mic.
Okay, so, sorry. My question is gonna be, given what was just said, a little bit complicated because one of the things that we struggle with right now is just like disagreement and tension and how we handle it. And one of the things that I was taught to do is to always look to history. And that's one of the things I try to do. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, because you guys mentioned there's this tension coming from the outside of people who were like, I don't want to be involved, this is too much, we want to stay away from you. And then there's also class struggle happening, right? You're like, some people have come so far, they have so much, and what for? And they don't even acknowledge the reason why they have it. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how you handled that tension at the time, both with other Black people, other poor people who were scared, the Black middle class who was like, no, and also inside the movement, like what it was like when you had disagreements And then my second question is, when you got stuck, this is a leadership question. When you got stuck, how did you get unstuck? When you didn't know what to do, when you felt like you didn't know how to move on. Like for me, I read history. That's what I do. Doesn't always help. I get it wrong a lot. But what did you do?
I went to Jesus. I tell him all about Jesus. That's what I mean about spirituality. As, I won't say angry because I have been an angry child for a long time, but I've learned how to suppress that. Especially when I'm seeing someone else more angrier than I am. The thing is that there's a lot of people that don't even know themselves. Another thing I always say to people is that it's too many people dying today that have never really lived. So are we living today? When we're trying to tell you about the things that's going on in this world and what we can do about it, if I run into someone that disagree, well, you have that privilege. Honey, you should have been in some of the SNCC meetings. You would think that it was a war. But when it was over with, it was over with. We don't have that today. You can agree to disagree. That's how we plan and how plan and history come in place. So if you don't know yourself, the first thing above all things is to know yourself. When you truly know yourself and you have already been through the fire, you know how to handle things. You know how to treat people kindly. And even if they're not taking it kindly, you don't react. Most people think I react. I be wanting to hit you in your head or your throat. But I don't. But I can look at you so crazy, you can read me right away and you just walk away. So that's how I have learned. And that's the tools that we need to go through this thing you call life. The first tool is to truly know yourself. And when you know yourself, you can judge with anyone because you're not going to lose your inner man. So when I get into places that I'm stuck, I look to Jesus. Most people think when I say something like that, it's, Jesus, what can Jesus do? Well, hell, I was, excuse me. I was the same way one time, child. I didn't believe in God. God done took my mama. He done sent me back to Selma, Alabama from California to a life that I really didn't know from my elementary years. Now here I am a teenager. My mama's gone and I'm the only child. All my friends today are mostly men because after my mother died, I didn't run into nothing but rude old women. And I didn't like them. Don't like them today either. So my friends became men. Everybody thought we were going together. This is my brother. I was always with the fellas. But I watched other women. I was Black. So in Selma, to be Black, I come from a class of people with the major breasts, the long hair, the pretty girls, the brown complexion. I'm Black. So I had to figure out a complex. I didn't even know what that word was. Withdrawn. It took a lot to bring me to this place that I am today. And the people that brought me here were the people of the movement, not family. People of the movement, the history, the education, and pushed me. They just kept pushing me. You can do this. Things I didn't want to do. We don't have that today. They were more family to me than my original family ever could be to me. So if it had not been for those people and these people, that's what I say. what would my life would have been like? Because I was already broken. And a broken person, when you hit that desperation, all I wanted was to get out of Selma, Alabama. I didn't want no parts of it. So I didn't get involved until the movement came. And when the movement came, the history came. So when I tell you, God will put people in your path to get you to your next destination. He has done it for me over and over and over again, even though I didn't like him. But he carried me, even when I didn't know he was carrying me. That's what I pass on today. Above all things, be true to yourself. And the most important thing is to know yourself. I pass that on to all the younger generations, because if it wasn't for me being around good people, ooh, I would think if I had took that left road, what I'd have been like. But that's what I give to all the younger generations. We've come a long way and we've fought a long, hard fight. And when I look today, everything that we have fought for have practically been taken away. 1964. Here we are, 2024. All the things that we fought for, they took piece by piece of the Voters' Right Bill. What could we do about it? Better go vote you. I'm telling you, let's go vote. Our life is at stake. We didn't have king then. So in 64, when I tell you it was like Moses leading the people out of Egypt, who is our Moses today? We are our Moses. So get on your job. And above all things, love yourself. I'm not seeing enough love in the world today. That's why we just so up and down. No people loving each other. Loving each other, half of you don't even like each other. And you better start singing. Movement today don't have no singing. No spirituality. We got all the education in the world, King said. Get a good education. Get a good education. It's the only thing man can't take away from you. Good education. But education without common sense, education without a good heart, education when you're only concerned about yourself serves no purpose. And as my old grandmama said, the worst thing in the world is an educated fool. And that's what we have a lot of today. Look around you. The world is in a bad shape today behind educated people. Let's get it together. Get an education, but get it with heart. Love in your heart. Get back to love, to the basics. I'm thinking.
Well, I'm thinking that we have three examples sort of in front of us. And where I started was talking about going to the SDS stick conference, and that there weren't more than 50 people there. So there weren't more than 50 people. So it was a small group. Example number one. Example number two, what both Terry and Betty have been talking about. This is a group of maybe at most 10 high school students in Selma, Alabama. Made a difference. They just kept working and kept doing. The third one I'm thinking of is Dorothy and this project. she just had this project. I mean, she just had this project. Somehow it got done. And I think it's just that you just decide what you want to do and you do it. And you find people who work with you, who have the same vision at the time. That group may change as it goes along, or it may expand, but you know what you need to do and what is the best way to do it. And I think one of the wonderful things about SNCC was that ability to disagree, to say, I think this is the best, there was a big division over Bloody Sunday. The organization came out against participating in Bloody Sunday. We decided we wanted to continue to do organizing, not demonstrating so much. And yet, there was also an allowance that if you thought you should do it, go ahead. So I think that kind of acceptance that we're all here trying to figure out what to do, and I may not agree with you, but you do your thing, I'll do my thing. And that was, again, I think there was no party line, no rules, no, there was, you could decide basically what you wanted to do and how you wanted to do it. And I think that was one of the things that led to the kind of creative and interesting activities that we were able to put forth. It was because we let people do what was their thing, what was the best thing for them to be involved in.
It do works, but it takes effort on both sides. It took me maybe 2 years to get back with my best friend that stood in front of me. We was close again. We didn't change our mind about what we was doing, but we was close again. We had something that we had in common that couldn't be taken away. And it worked. One is still here, the other one is gone, but we are still friends. Same thing when we had a different with organization, James Orange and I. SNCC said one thing in Marion, SNCC said something else, SCLC said something else. But when it came down to the end, we was one. It worked. It never been a thing where one person make a decision and be the whole group or the whole community. So yes, you can, it's not a catwalk to be on one accord at all times, but you can always come to that point where this is best, not for me, but for everybody. And this is what our goal, and that's what we look out and go to. Because right now, I have people that work for SCLC. They just like Bettie. We call and we talk, and we be glad, we be just like little kids. If I see them, I take off and run because I'm glad to see them.
Yeah.
So it's not a division. It was just two names, but it was one focus.
Y'all, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Ms. Bettie Mae Fikes, Martha Prescod, Norman Noonan, Mr. Terry Shaw. So, yes, please give it up. So we've got a break now. We've got lunch. out in the lobby. Please help yourselves. We're gonna come back about 1 o'clock for our second session, introduce our speakers. So please get some food, get to know each other, gather in the spirit of the movement over lunch, and we will resume right around 1 o'clock.
So I've been in the storm so long, but I'm trying to make heaven my now. If you miss me from the back of the bus and you can't find me nowhere, just come on up to the front of the bus and I'll be sitting up there. Well, now I'll be sitting up there. I'll be sitting up there. Just come on up to the front of the bus and I'll be sitting up there. Now if you miss me from the back of the bus and you can't find me nowhere, just come on up to the front of the bus and I'll be driving up there. Well, now I'll be driving up there somewhere. I'll be driving up there. Just come on up to the front of the bus and I'll be driving up there. Well, now if you miss me from the Mississippi River and you can't find me nowhere, just come on over to the YMCA and I'll be swimming over there. Well, now I'll be swimming over there. I'll be swimming over there. Just come on over to the YMCA and I'll be swimming over there. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. Oh, well, I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Well, it ain't no harm to keep your mind set on freedom. Oh, well, it ain't no harm to keep your mind, Lord, set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep your mind set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
One more round of applause for Ms. Bettie Fikes. All right, welcome back. What do we think about that first panel? We learned a lot. We're going to keep learning. This afternoon, we are having a panel that's focused more on the importance and the significance of not just remembering, teaching, writing movement history, but how we write, how we study, how we teach movement history from the bottom up. How we present these histories in ways that are true to the spirit and the legacies of the stories that we heard this morning. So to join in this conversation, we have to my left Professor Jeanne Theoharis, who is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York, and the co-author or author of 9 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, the history of social welfare, and rights in post-9/11 America. Her New York Times best-selling biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, has won a 2014 NAACP Image Award and the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and has also been made into a documentary of the same name, and also a young adult version of the book is in print as well. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jeanne Theoharis. Do I need to reintroduce Martha Prescod, Norman Noonan?
Yes, please.
Martha Prescod, Norman Noonan. Please. I'll give the brief version. Journey as a civil rights activist began during her first year at the University of Michigan in 1961, where she met SNCC activists including Curtis Hayes and Tom Hayden. Their commitment to change inspired her deeply, making her realize that young people like herself could alter the racial landscape. She quickly became involved raising funds for SNCC and organizing support efforts in Detroit, and worked throughout the South in Albany, Georgia, Greenwood, Mississippi, and Selma, Alabama. And I won't read the full length again because I don't want to preempt what Ms. Noonan is going to share with us as well. So please join me in welcoming again Martha Prescod. And then last but not least, the woman who is responsible for us being here today, for organizing this program and the 3 days of programming that has taken place to commemorate the new monument in Viola Liuzzo Park on Winthrop Street on the west side, honoring Mrs. Liuzzo, Mrs. Sarah Evans, and all of the foot soldiers in the movement, particularly those who came down from Detroit and those who were from Selma, Alabama, which is Mrs. Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge. Now, I'm reading Mrs. Aldridge's full introduction because she is somebody who does not get enough recognition in history in this town. So we're going to take some time to give Dorothy her flowers today. Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge, born in Detroit, Michigan, has dedicated her life to civil and human rights advocacy. Her activism began in the 1950s as a member of the Triple City NAACP Youth Council. From 1960 to 1963, she worked full-time with the Northern Student Movement Tutorial Project as the civil rights movement spread to the north. And what Dorothy doesn't take enough credit for, and people don't give her enough credit for, is that she was the co-founder of the Detroit Education Project, the chapter of the new Northern Student Movement in Detroit. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge Dorothy's contributions there, as well as Frank Joyce, who's in the room too, who's another founding member. In 1963, Dorothy joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as co-director of the Detroit office and later became its director. She worked on the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, and she served with SNCC until 1969, working on other important matters, including the Chucky Howell and Algiers motel murder cases, both of which involved assassinations of Black citizens by Detroit police, the National Black Economic Development Conference, and collaborations with Grace and Jimmy Bottoms. In 1965, under the guidance of James Foreman, Dorothy and her colleagues in Detroit adopted the Lowndes County Project, forming a lasting bond with the community. This relationship led to the creation of the Michigan Lowndes County Christian Movement for Human Rights, which supported voting rights and acquisition and educational opportunities in Lowndes County, Alabama. Dorothy was one of the first U.S. citizens to visit China just prior to its reopening in 1972. She was a voting delegate to the 6th Pan-African Congress in Tanzania in 1974 and also participated in the anti-apartheid and African liberation support movements in 1974. Dorothy continues her civil rights advocacy. She is a board member of the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights and the Viola Liuzzo Park Association, and she serves on the annual MLK committee and is a member of the National Council of Elders. Please, y'all give it up for Dorothy Dewberry. All right, so now that we know who we're learning from this afternoon and in conversation with, to get into this topic of how movement history is written, remembered, misremembered, misrepresented, I want to start off with Professor Theoharis and ask how and why have the histories of the civil rights movement been misrepresented, manipulated, and misused?
Thank you, and it's such an honor to be here, and it's obviously a little intimidating to be on this panel, but I'm glad I'm going first. So I thought I might talk about my journey to the Parks book, because in that journey was a realization that I think we began to hear on our first panel, which is that sometimes we just don't learn the history at all, but sometimes memorializing becomes a way of stripping the history. And so people may remember in October 2005, Rosa Parks died at the age of 92. And we saw an unprecedented national honoring of Mrs. Parks. She became the first woman, the first civilian, and the second African American to lie in honor in the US Capitol. President Bush came and paid his honor. 40,000 Americans also came. Then her body was brought back to Detroit for an epic 6-hour star-studded funeral. And yet, she was constantly referred to as quiet, not angry, quiet, soft-spoken, quiet. And I started to think about how maybe we couldn't divorce this national outpouring for Mrs. Parks from what had happened 2 months earlier, which was the travesty of federal negligence during and after Hurricane Katrina, which had brought to the surface kind of enduring questions of social and racial inequality. And it seemed to me we couldn't separate that congressional stampede to have a public funeral for Mrs. Parks from that happening less than 2 months earlier. And so I actually gave a talk about this, how do we remember, and thinking about Mrs. Parks' funeral, and a friend said, well, we could turn that talk into a chapter for the book. I said, okay. I'm like, okay, I need to find, the biography of Mrs. Parks. I really want to fill out her history. And there was no serious biography of Rosa Parks, which seemed to correspond again to this problem, which is that on the one hand, we were having this epic honoring of Mrs. Parks, and yet the notion that a serious footnoted scholarly biography we did not have. We had scores of children's books, but not a serious biography. And so I began working on my biography. And I want to show you a second moment of this kind of public honoring and stripping, and that comes in 2013. And as many of us know, a statue of Mrs. Parks was put in the Capitol Statuary Hall. It's the first full-size statue of a Black person to be put in that hall. President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, they're all there. And across the street that day, if I was a novelist, they wouldn't let me get away with this. But across the street that day, the Supreme Court was hearing arguments in Shelby County v. Holder, the case that would ultimately strip a key provision from the Voting Rights Act. So here we were having this celebration and pageantry, and across the street, one of the things that Mrs. Parks and so many people in this room had fought for was being stripped. And it was not just coincidental, right? The honoring and the memorializing and the putting in a sepia tone, right, Mrs. Parks, was essential to the ruling that the Supreme Court made, which is that this problem we have fixed, right? This is based on 40-year-old facts, right? So that memorial helps us establish that's a problem in the past. So I wanted to begin with that in terms of thinking about the ways that sometimes the history we get is not the history we need. And so I embarked between 2005 and 2013 on a biography of Mrs. Parks. And I thought I knew things. You know, I knew she was not a simple seamstress. I knew she was NAACP activist, and she'd gone to Highlander. And in some ways, I think that's one of the newer myths about her. It's like, oh, we know that stuff. But what had not been foregrounded, what had not been really taken seriously, was what many of us in this room know, which is that Mrs. Parks spent more than half of her life fighting the racism of the Jim Crow North in Detroit, in what she called the Northern Promised Land that wasn't. But I think to take seriously that second half of her life, to talk about, to remember, to mark Mrs. Parks's work around prisoner defense committees, around police brutality, around U.S. foreign policy, around anti-poverty programs, would be to have to admit that the problems are still here. If we constantly just mark her as a bus seat, right, and every December 1st, bus seats across the country bear her name, and there's all sorts of goofy things that celebrate her, but that don't celebrate the fact that to the end of her life, she said, there's more work to be done, the struggle isn't over. And so I guess that's where I wanted to begin today, is to sort of what does it mean to kind of focus on Mrs. Parks here in Detroit and to sort of foreground that story. Because I think that story makes us ask different questions. Thank you.
Mrs. Aldridge, as someone who knew and worked alongside Mrs. Parks, I'm going to come to you next. As Professor Theoharis mentioned, the history that we get isn't always the history that we need. And Mrs. Aldridge, I think, is someone who's been ensuring that the history that we need is getting to the youth throughout her work, dating back to work with NAACP Youth Councils and Northern Student Movement, and going up through the freedom tours that she organized and led throughout the South. So, Mrs. Aldridge, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about those freedom tours that you organized, where those came from, how you went about organizing those, and the kinds of things that students were learning through those experiences.
Well, thank you. I love to talk about freedom tours. We began the freedom tours in about 1989 was the first time we took off and left Detroit and went south. The idea of the freedom tours when they first began, I was just so pleased and happy about my experience in the South that I wanted to share that with the young people of Detroit. One of my favorite things was to sit on the porch in Lowndes County at the knee of the elders and listen to their stories and how they had overcome, how they created ways out of no way, and how they continue to be happy and prideful, and what did they do from, how did they keep themselves happy, and while they were so, wanted to share. For instance, everyone we went south, and people opened their doors. They shared everything that they had, what little they had. And why would they do that was the question. So we organized these tours around the young people, ages, high school age, young people, 14 to 18, to go south and to see what lessons they could learn about what they did and how did the people in the South go fighting lions with a switch? Why would they do that? It was very difficult, it was dangerous. So what could we learn about their experiences in the South to make them applicable to our lives here in Detroit? So now there was extensive training, of course, discussion before we left, and we had to talk with the parents, and we was, oh my goodness, it was wonderful that the parents would entrust us as, you know, chaperones or mentors with their children's lives, and they did, and it was just wonderful. So we continued the Freedom Tours with the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights from about 1989 to pandemic years. I'm also on the board of the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute. And so in 1990, the Rosa and Raymond Parks began what we call reverse freedom tours. In other words, we brought young people from the South, and they came to Detroit and to learn what they could about their lives as well. Now, the freedom tours that Mrs. Parks and the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute tended to go from the South and, you know, come to Detroit, of course, and learn what they could about how we lived here. But we went to Canada, spent a lot of time in Canada, visiting the historic sites where the African Americans had gone across the river and formed all these little settlements. So that was the way, and the Freedom Tour started with the Rose Parks. And they also, we also had extensive training about how to get along. And to me, it was magical, something magical about getting on a bus and spending 2 weeks with your fellow people who were interested in the history, and it was good. So that's what we did. We got on the bus. We trained the young people. We trained the young people with the Rosa Parks Institute, and what they call their tours. And they eventually, like I said, it was called the Reverse Freedom Tour. And eventually, Mrs. Parks and the Rosa and Raymond Parks called their tours Pathways to Freedom. And those continued as well until the pandemic. The pandemic really created a lot of havoc with folks. Okay, among other things, it became more expensive to take young people. But there may be some efforts to continue the Freedom Tours later on, and we're still working with it. Okay, so And when we went south, what did we do? Now, mind you, this is before there are museums. This is before the museums. So we would go and visit the local student groups that were doing things. We would be forced to talk and have relationships with the people that we visited. That was important. I have a picture and show you how things changed. We have a picture, I had a picture of Mrs. Viola Liuzzo. Of course, we know she was killed on Highway 80 in 1965. But when we first went there, now we are putting a wreath in her honor on a fence. There were no markings, no anything. And the young people did that. After a while, the SCLC women built a monument to Mrs. Liuzzo on the highway. So we would visit that, and many times the monuments were defaced, bullet holes, and or writing terrible things on the monument. They did the same in Mississippi. We visited James Chaney's grave as a part of the Freedom Tour. Bullet holes to this day on the monument. So we visited, we observed and talked to people in the South. Mrs. Parks and his Providence that the three of us are here. Mrs. Parks traveled and met us in the South. And she was always freely giving of her time. I remember very well in the mid-70s, Sister Martha here, formed a food co-op out of necessity. Mrs. Parks had 13 nieces and nephews. Sylvester McCauley, her brother, lived in Southwest Detroit, and he was my neighbor, and Martha and I, so how did we do this? And I'll be presumptuous to explain it. Martha, Sister Martha here, decided that if you needed to go to the grocery store and you could spend $10, well, then you can find 10 people and spend $100. And that is a way we were economical to feed our families and help Mrs. Parks to feed her family as well, because we were forever going with these bags out to, they lived around the corner from me, but to Southwest Detroit and to see Mrs. Parks. So with the Freedom Tour, we were able to go and see a number of things that you can't do now. For instance, we drove down to Laredo, Texas, and during that period, you could just go and walk across the bridge to Laredo, Mexico, and spend the time. After 9/11, this is not possible. After 9/11, you can't just go to Canada. And that was a favorite thing that everyone would do. Go across to Windsor when the reverse tour came, and they would go to Windsor, write a postcard, and be so proud that they had been out of the country. So things changed, and now there are many, many beautiful museums across the South, in Birmingham, in Selma, in Lowndes County. But when we first started, and I'll just mention one thing about Lowndes County, we visited the one-room schoolhouse, the two-room schoolhouse. So those are the things that we did during that period, visiting the local areas, and now there are many museums that you visit. So I'll stop there and, be proud to answer any questions after.
I have a question I would like to ask now. Just to follow up, Ms. Aldridge, I noticed yesterday at the event at Viola Liuzzo Park, somebody was wearing a Freedom Tours shirt. And like the legacies of those Freedom Tours are so present in the city. And I know that you can, even though the Freedom Tours have been on hiatus since the pandemic, you've still been doing Freedom Tours in other ways. When I went down to Montgomery a couple of years ago for the Asala conference, I told you I was going down there, and you talked to me on the phone the whole tour route that I should go on. And so I brought one of my friends with me, and I just essentially communicated everything that you had told to me on that tour route. And that had a big impact on me, just being able to have that kind of direct connection to the history and the place that I was moving through, having never been to that, to Montgomery or Selma before. And so this is my long-winded way of asking you if you could speak a little bit more about the impacts that you saw the Freedom Tours have on young people over the years, how you saw them be moved or transformed or enlivened by those experiences and histories.
Oh, absolutely. There was a great deal of change created. Like I said, there's something magical to get on a bus and learn everyone's. Now, we also, when there were many sibling groups, in other words, in 1989, when your first brother or sister went, and then the parents were so impressed with the work that we did, then they would have their next child, and then their next, and their next. And many times we went through a family, many families, for these tours. And then after a while, the young people will want to be chaperones themselves. So it was very impactful on the lives of the young people. So that's what we want to continue these efforts when we can in the Detroit era. One of the things that was during the earlier periods, we would also go to Hamtramck, Michigan. Detroit has this uniqueness. They have two cities within the boundaries of our city. Hamtramck was a European city, not about 3-4 miles away from Detroit, right around the corner. And when you go, it was so unique, and it was different from Detroit, right around the corner. And it still is, but it's different in other ways, different ways. So we didn't have to go necessarily to the South. We went to Hamtramck, Michigan to see what we could do.
Thank you. Y'all, can we find a way to make these freedom tours happen again? I said, can we find a way to make these freedom tours happen again? All right.
No, we're not doing them now, but if you signed up over, when you came in or anything, and if we know of folks, we're gonna try to get them going maybe in 2025. Also, they're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March next year. And I can't hardly believe it. It's been 60 years. But we're going, some of us, it's called Jubilee, and some of us are, going to try to go. Many creative things, and I was just thinking about Margaret Walker. She wrote a poem, Jubilee, and when we went to visit Medgar Evers' home, which is also now a historic site in Jackson, Mississippi, then Mrs. Walker lived down the street, and we just knocked on her door and went to see her, and she was so gracious with her time. And so those are the kind of things we did on Freedom Tour. Mm-hmm. And we hope to do it again.
Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge. Ms. Noonan, I think one of the things that came out of that panel this morning was the importance of centering the roles of foot soldiers in the movement and how we teach, learn, and understand movement history. And particularly, many people, those foot soldiers who have been left out of movement history until relatively recently, is the role of women. And you were an editor of the landmark collection, Hands on the Freedom Plow, which brought together stories of women in SNCC. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about where that project came from, the work that went into publishing the book, and its significance in teaching movement history.
Yeah, one of the terms I try not to use. Oh, the mic.
Oh.
Between us. And it is the foot soldier name, because to me it sort of indicates that we were taking orders from somebody, and we were kind of a group of people that you couldn't tell what to do. Mm-hmm. So, and I want to say one other thing. When I went to Michigan, one of the most popular history teachers at the time was Sidney Fine. And he had his notes prepared to the minute. And so when I taught, I said, well, I'm going to do the same thing. And I did my notes and I taught my class. And at the end of the first class, a young lady came up to me and she said, oh, Ms. Norman, we really enjoyed your class. But you know, our last professor didn't need any notes. So I'm the only one here with notes today. It's a habit. And I want to start out with, of course, people started at a point asking, what was it like to be a woman in the civil rights movement? And they would say, oh, you know, there's all these stories, and of course the Stokely Carmichael comment, oh, the man treated you so badly, and so forth and so on. And I had to stop and think about it for a minute. I wasn't really paying attention to the men because it was so, we were meeting so many phenomenal women. And we came into the movement knowing Mrs. Parks, knowing of Daisy Bates, knowing of 5-year-old children integrating schools. So we had this behind us, and then we go into the movement, meeting Diane Nash, meeting Fannie Lou Hamer. So the whole issue of what a woman could do, and as I mentioned earlier, when Diane came here to speak in the summer of '62, she left in labor. That said to me, a woman in the movement could do just about anything. So that was there. And I think that whole story of how we interacted with each other is not told that much, and actually isn't told that much in this book. But, and I wanted to say, one of the reasons, actually the main reason I went to Selma was because I had heard about Bettie Fikes. The first thing I heard, another SNCC person from Detroit, Gerald Bray, had been to Selma, and he came back to Detroit and he said, you know, in Selma, they have this whole different way of singing. And they have this young woman there, and when she sings This Little Light of Mine, you have never heard it before. It's a whole different thing. And then in the summer of '64, in Atlantic City, I was walking up to the demonstration that we had on the boardwalk, and you could hear her at least a block and a half over. You know, the boardwalk's on the ocean. This is outside. And I said to when they asked me where did I want to go when I finished school, and they gave me some choices, and Selma, Alabama was one. I said, that's where I'm going, because I want to hear some more of that music. Well, different people had talked over the years about doing biographies of SNCC workers. The actual impetus for Hands came from Faith Holsard, also one of the editors, after she was invited to participate in the White Woman's autobiographical project, which was published later under the title Deep in Our Hearts. Faith felt uncomfortable, as she put it, doing a project in racial isolation, when her civil rights activity was just the opposite. She wrote to me asking my opinion, and I said, you know, in the true SNCC spirit, I would support whatever she decided. By the way, Faith is another SNCC activist who lived in Detroit for 7 or 8 years, I think. After she spoke to a few other African-American SNCC women, a committee was formed of 3 black women and 3 white women, and the project began. You know, we're SNCC women, so getting us to agree on anything is interesting, but I want to talk about the things that we actually did agree on. We sent invitations to all the SNCC women we knew collectively who had spent at least 6 consecutive months working for SNCC in the South. That was the first qualification to be in the book. And the result of the 52 participants, including ourselves, 36 were black, 14 white, and 2 Latinos. 21 of the women were born in the South. 3 of whom were white Southerners, Casey Hayden Jones and Jeanette King. 14 of the African American women worked with SNCC in the towns where they were born, and another 2 were close to home. We made a real effort to reach out to Southern-born women, as of course the overwhelming number of movement participants were Southern Black women, and we felt that they were pretty much left out of a lot of the history or included as sort of the exceptional person. And it was kind of interesting. Our first publisher, now I don't remember the press, I remember our publisher was a woman named Theoharis. The first publisher we had for the book said, well, you know, what this manuscript you got is too long, because it's like 580 pages. So what we're going to recommend for you is that we're going to cut the book. And when they did it, and the people they took out, it immediately changed to be a story of Northern white women's participants. They left out Diane Nash, Bernice Reagan, and it just, so we had to get it up. That was it. When the book was published in 2010, 4 of the participants had died. Now it's at least 20. We also wanted to balance the previous emphasis on Mississippi as the focus of movement activity. And so we did balance, I think, the 10 chapters in the book. Only 2 are about Mississippi. There are 2 chapters on the Albany movement, 1 on Cambridge, and another on the Alabama movement. And then in order to emphasize the importance of the Cambridge movement, which is the whole movement, Cambridge and Danville, and I think because of their militants actually are often, because of their militants and because they occurred in the northern part of the South, are often left out of civil rights history. So we put Gloria Richardson's essay, which is the head of the Cambridge, and again, one of our heroines, at the center of the book. It's dead center in the book. Obviously, we wanted to present a fuller picture of SNCC women than existed in the late 1990s. Hands, if you read it, you will see in Casey Hayden's work, women doing the work all the way up and down. From putting whiskers on the Clark College's panther to create that symbol, to determining the future of the movement by deciding to continue the freedom rides as Diane Nash did. You will see women as an integral part of the SNCC organization, yet freely independent and creative. Also important to us was shining a light on the Albany movement. One of the most depressing reunions I went to was an Albany movement. I think it was the 20-year anniversary, and they had several historians who were doing work on the Albany movement make presentations, and they all described the Albany movement as a failure. And they were talking to the participants of the Albany movement. So that, again, led me to start thinking, well, I've been thinking about it before, of how we treat movement history. And I think there are several quick things that I think are key. And that is, if we're looking at a movement for social change, like the Albany movement, it should be judged by the amount of social change it represents. within the historical possibilities of those times and when the activities took place. And we need to keep in mind that all these efforts, great and small, represented an attack on Southern white supremacy. So I guess King, in his writings, described, and I'm using this as an example, he described the Albany movement as a failure because an agreement was made and not kept. The buses were closed, they were stopped rather than integrated. But there's another reality going on here at that time that makes the Albany movement a victory. And anywhere in the South where there were sit-ins or other kinds of attempts at integration where they closed the facilities rather than integrate them, it is still a defeat for the white Southern supremacists because they can't keep a segregated facility. That's a victory. They can't do it. The second thing in Albany, which was a victory, and again in other places, people were willing to go to jail. People were willing to go to jail. Okay. People were willing to go to jail. This is raising civil rights activism to a whole nother level. And it is taking one of the most important arrows out of the quiver of Southern white supremacists, because that's the threat. If you do this, we're going to put you in jail. So not only did people go to jail in Albany, they went to jail by the hundreds. This is unprecedented. So anyway, that's my point. Now, these were some of the things that there was some controversy about. I wrote the bridges to ants, and you will see a very carefully worded section in the introduction that says that the bridges were written by Martha and Faith. Oh, the bridges were written by Martha and Faith, which meant that some of the other editors were not happy with the bridges. So I want to quickly go over what I think are the three myths of the civil rights movement when you're reading or writing or assessing this history. The first is the awakening myth. And if you, Eyes on the Prize, the first,
The Awakening.
it's called Awakening. The book on SNCC is, I think, SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s. And I think this does a tremendous disservice, actually, not just to the immediate history, but to the decades of activism that preceded 1960. And it's even more dangerous in that what it suggests is that there was a passive Southern Black community previous to that. And so if then you can come to the conclusion, well, if Black people had just done something, everything. The second, I think, is the leadership myth. And of course, to me, King, of course, sucks up all the oxygen of civil rights history. And and determines its nature, I think, when people start talking about the civil rights. But also organizations. I mean, there's a sense that we got everything going rather than the opposite. And I think when we were talking this morning, Betty referred to the people who were there in Selma, who were active before, in very careful ways. And I think overall, for instance, Haywood, the efforts of the tenant farmers in Haywood and Fayette counties in Tennessee in 59 and 60, when they went down to register to vote, as a result, it kicked off the plantation and formed a tent city, which also was supported by students in Ann Arbor and Jim Foreman back then. Their actions signaled to civil rights organizations that people were willing to give up everything for the right to vote. Then you have voter registration. So I think, again, in the history, we have to be very careful about seeing it as something that the organizations or the leadership brought into being. The other myth, I think, is that this was an integrated movement. The freedom struggle that I participated in was a Southern Black freedom struggle. Yeah. And if you write this history as an integrated history, as happens, somehow, again, the history is sucked up by the white participants, and you do not get to see what it is Southern Black people brought to this movement. I think by numbers, by determination, by sacrifice, by consistency, by culture, it's a Black Southern freedom struggle. And you can see it, how people facing the kinds of daily struggle that was necessary to survive in the white terrorist South, created a struggle culture that was what propelled the Southern civil rights movement. And it's just so easy in the music that we could take the gospel songs, we're soldiers in the army, and with very little effort, turn it into a political song. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Noonan.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. The work. I forgot about the work. You did ask me about that. We divided, the work that we did was, initially, we divided ourselves into 3 groups of 2, black and white, and went through all of the manuscripts. And then we went over them as a group. And then it ended up that it sort of divided into Faith and myself being the editors for maybe 36, 37 of the pieces, and the group of 4 doing the others. So it was interesting, and I think we were fortunate in that everything with what we, this was just random. We sent out letters, we took the manuscripts that came back, that we had a history of SNCC from its inception until the late 60s. So it's a pretty good book.
I think calling Hands on the Freedom Plow a pretty good book might be the understatement of the year. It's a monumental contribution to movement history. I want to acknowledge some of the folks that are featured in the book that are in the room today as well. So we've heard from Ms. Bettie Fikes, who's featured, as well as Marilyn Lowen, who's in the room, who's featured. Before we open it up for questions and conversation, Professor Theoharis, I wanted to ask you to kind of take us a step further in terms of the conversation about the misrepresentations of movement history, and talk to us a bit about how the manipulations and misrepresentations of movement history impact us in the present, and particularly are used and weaponized against younger organizers and activists, and maybe how Mrs. Parks' more authentic story helps us to build on her legacy in the present.
Thank you. This is one of my favorite topics, pet peeves. And part of, if we go to that moment when Mrs. Parks dies, or if we go to 2013, one of the lasting, as Professor Blackmer was saying, problems with that way of memorializing, that quiet, not angry, quiet, soft-spoken, quiet version, is that it's then weaponized against young people and against activists today because you're not doing it the right way. And there's this sense, and I think going to some of the myths that Noonan was just getting us at, I think another myth is that somehow people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King were acceptable and respectable and beloved. Even if we go to the Selma Montgomery March, one of the things we know is that along the route of that march were huge blow-up photos of Mrs. Parks and Martin Luther King at Highlander Folk School with basically signage saying, you know, communist training school, right? And they are considered communists in 55, but they are considered communists in 65 too. And if you go down the street to the Ruther, where Mrs. Parks's first part of her papers lie, there is a folder of hate mail that Congressman Conyers gets when he hires her. And a lot of that hate mail is not from the South, it's from the North. And it's, you know, you're a troublemaker. You know, this is 1966, 1967, right? Still saying, we don't want you up here in the North. You know, you cause problems. And so I think part of this myth then says, oh, back in the day, they did it the right way, and they weren't disruptive, even though they were incredibly disruptive. Or my biggest pet peeve, you may remember the former mayor of Atlanta, Kasim Reeve, saying, Martin Luther King would never take a highway. And you're like, what do you think? I mean, Selma to Montgomery, you know, there's so many moments. What do you think that was? And also, King saying over and over and over, right, that disruption is essential and that you do not blame the physician for pointing out the cancer, right? Which is one of King's, I think, best rejoinders to this constant refrain that they are too disruptive, that they are causing the tension, which is obviously what young people are being treated like today. And so I think one of the biggest stakes of these myths is the ways that then they're rolled out to somehow say, if you go about it the right way, of course in a democracy like in the United States, things just change and you're just not going about it the right way. And I think we've heard a lot today also about what it cost and what it took and the decades of work and where you start the story. And I think the dangers of the myths, and I like to call them a fable because I think fable gets at the kind of moralistic ways that they get used in the present, to shut down kind of the ongoing need for change and disruption today. And so I think part of trying to tell this bigger, fuller history is, in fact, about then making those connections between the ongoing struggle. And again, I'm going to tell you another pet peeve that I'm having. So, as many of you may know, the Henry Ford Museum, right around the corner in Dearborn, is acquiring the Jackson House. And the Jackson House is the house of a local activist, and one of the claims to fame is it's the house where Dr. King watched President Johnson kind of basically make the call for the Voting Rights Act. And that house is being moved to Greenfield Village. But I think this presents an opportunity. And I've been trying to tell them it presents an opportunity, and I think we should all tell them that this presents an opportunity, which is not just to, I think there's a danger then about the house just being about a movement in a moment, not an ongoing movement, and also being just about the South and not about Detroit. And I think the Jackson House provides an opportunity, given that they're doing all this fundraising and they're really changing things around, to wrap around an exhibit about the Black freedom struggle here in Detroit and the connections to the Black freedom struggle in Alabama. And so I think we want to be talking with them and pushing them and insisting that, I mean, they're raising millions of dollars, I mean, to do this. And I think that, again, opens an opportunity for us to have, you know, a broader conversation about what then, because the Henry Ford is such a site for school visits, what it would mean to have a kind of wraparound exhibit that was about segregation and struggle in Detroit, what it would mean to talk about kind of the connections between Alabama and Detroit. And so I just wanted to put that out there for us to be thinking collectively about in the next year or two, is that, I mean, I think the house is here, but it hasn't, you know, but I think they're more receptive now to the idea that maybe they're falling down on the job of not, you know, portraying the history of the city and of Black struggle in the city. But I think they still need some pushing. But I think it's an opportunity, and to link what we've been talking about today and these fuller histories. Yeah.
How many of us have questions we'd like to pose? Okay. Well, I'm gonna go get the mic and bring it out there. I want to see some more hands in a couple minutes. Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question or a comment. I'm 67 years old. I didn't grow up in the church, but okay. I didn't grow up in the church, but I became a believer in Christ at an early age. And I've been on this journey of trying to figure out why Black people, Black Americans, are marked for discrimination. Why other people come in our community and they seem to be able to, you know, start their businesses, prosper. Why do we have this continuous fight for our First Amendment rights, for our freedom? Why are we being targeted by the police, targeted by other people? We all know what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what has happened in several cities across the nation. We know about Sonia Massey, who called the police, and the police came in and basically shot her after she said a couple words, and she didn't apologize for what she said. So for me, it has been a journey. I've watched other people come to this country. For example, the Ukrainian immigrants come here and be given basically first-class citizenship. I listened to a ton of videos where the Black community in Chicago, New York, and other places in the nation are talking about how other people are able to come here now with open borders and be given assistance for housing, job training, food stamps, shelter, everything. So in my journey, I've read the Bible. I have several Bibles, and I'm going to try to put this together and try to make sense, because I have all these thoughts about it. But it boils down to the fact that, and I know some Black people here in this room have heard this before, but we fit the scriptures of a people who have been scattered, who have went back into slavery. As it notes in Deuteronomy 28:68, you'll go back into bondage. And we fit the scriptures of a people that went to the four corners of the earth through the transatlantic slave trade. I know there were Black people here before Europeans came here too. So I'm just trying to say, for those of us who are believers and those of us who still hold on to our faith, and those of us who still see some credibilities in the scriptures, that I would strongly encourage you to look at the scriptures, read the chapter from the entire Bible, because it's a story of Black history. And it's a story of, and that doesn't mean that other people are not included in that history. So I don't want to come off as someone who's exclusive. But specifically, it speaks to the conditions that we are living in. For example, my husband keeps nudging me to kind of shut up. But we're going to just give you a couple scriptures. Here in Isaiah 42, 22 through 25. These are people who have been robbed, who have been spoiled as a people that everything is taken, who are hidden in prison houses. Another scripture, Isaiah 11, talks about we are to be regathered from different places in the Middle East, and Judah specifically, from the four corners of the earth. We were dispersed to North America, we were dispersed to South America, to Europe, Asia, etc. So we have been scattered. Another scripture that I always wonder why there's so much, okay, I'm going to try to break it down. Why there's so much animosity towards Black people? Why do the Europeans and Black people all over the globe are suffering? Our conditions are a lot of the same. If you go to the islands, if you go to Africa, North America, Asia, Black people are discriminated against. They're the least desired, et cetera, et cetera. In the book of Ezekiel 35, it says that Esau has a perpetual hatred towards the descendants of Jacob, towards Jacob. So for those of us, that are not familiar with the scriptures, I'm just inviting you to look at it, because we fit the description of those people absolutely perfectly. We are those people. So I'm just going to say this and I'll close it out. Things are not, we're free to go into, I would say, we're at the last days according to the scriptures, tribulation. And I can see Black people being silenced. We're being told that we live in a colorblind society. We are being told that if you talk about racism, you're a racist. So our voice is being quieted. We're no longer the first minority in the country. We're like the second minority because, we have Hispanics and we have other people that have come into the country. So our voices are being like silenced in a very strategic way. And once your voice is silent, then who will hear our cries? Who will care about the police shootings? Who will care that we are disenfranchised and our communities are starved of resources? Who will care once we lose our numbers and other people outnumber us in a political spectrum?
And I think that point about silencing is a really important one right now. When we're witnessing across the nation this massive and calculated attack on Black studies, on critical race theory, as it's usually packaged under, DEI, all the code talk that's essentially weaponized to silence histories of, let's say, Black history, critical U.S. histories, Black studies as a lens into U.S. and global histories. So I think this poses an important question for us to engage with, which is, in this political context, what lessons can we draw, what sustenance can we draw from traditions of struggle to continue teaching these histories, to continue teaching these traditions of struggle as has been done for generations? Mrs. Aldridge, would you like to speak to that at all? About what lessons we might draw from the Black freedom movement, about how we continue to teach African American history, histories of the movement? Yeah, either Mrs. Aldridge or Mrs. Noonan, could you speak a little bit about what lessons we might draw from the movement about the importance and the methods of teaching Black history today?
And would you repeat that? I'm sorry.
What lessons might we be able to draw from the movement? I'm thinking about freedom schools, perhaps, for how we today can be teaching Black history, movement history, in a period of heightened political attack.
Well, that's why we began tours, the freedom tours, to draw lessons that the young people can, and information that the young people can take for their daily lives. And we think that those tours and information and the Black history and all those sort of things need to be reinstituted in the high schools, elementary schools, and beyond. When in the days, say in the 1960s, 65s or so, there were independent efforts to do things. In other words, if there were difficulties, then we formed our own freedom school. We found our own ways to find solutions. We formed the full co-ops, we did things like that. So there are efforts, and we should continue those kind of efforts.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruth, and I would like to just tell my dear sister, I hear you. I hear what you're saying, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. But I'd also like to address, because I am a believer, I do study the Bible. I try to live what the Bible teaches me. And this is my opinion, my heartfelt opinion. I do believe we're in the last days, and we'll see increasing violence, division, wars, and rumors of war. That is the reality. But we have some choices, even what we do now. Couple things, I'll make two major points, and I'd be happy to talk to you later, because again, I hear you. One is, there's always been differences, distinctions, and discrimination, divisions, even divisiveness. And the Bible speaks about even strange women, not to marry strange women, women from other tribal groups or colors. But really the message is, the division is between believers and non-believers. And I understand we have different faiths or people who do not follow any faith, but my Bible teaches me that is the most important division, is between believers and non-believers. But I think that also extends to the work we do. It is very hard to have a movement where you have division and you focus on the differences. But there's no problem, I don't have a problem making distinctions and to discriminate not on the basis of color, but on words, actions, and values. The other point I would like to make is, and this is for my sister and whoever else wants to hear it, we cannot judge spiritual things by worldly systems and ways. So when you try to make sense of why things happen, I can preach, but Dr. Hammer, you can stop me. I think that's going to be faulty, and you're going to feel frustrated because some of this is evil. Whether you accept that there is evil in the world, evil explains a lot of what human beings do to one another. But again, I talked about choices. Many people follow the evil and not the good and not the love. And what I heard you talk about is the manifestation of evil over time, both Bible times and now. But we don't succumb to evil. And again, our analysis, yes, must be scholarly, must be informed by history and by our values. But I would also suggest that our first analysis is always spiritual. I hope that helps.
I just want to stress over and over again that we are the people of the book. We are the people. We are the descendants of Judah. We fit those scriptures perfectly.
Well, first I want to thank all the panelists for guiding us, to understanding what happened 60 years ago. In terms of interpreting our position today, meaning African American people, I think because of our social history in this country, has put us in a very important and pivotal position in terms of making change. Even in the Bible, if we talk about how the Bible is interpreted, has a lot to do with people's attitudes and how they take action. For example, the myth that African people are the descendants of Ham, that they're cursed to be drawers of water and hewers of wood, all that was imposed by the slave system. And it depends on how people interpret the Bible. For example, Nat Turner, he was a preacher in Virginia,
And his, I heard his great-great-great-grandson speak. Nat Turner taught himself how to read, how to preach. He was able to travel to different plantations in that region of Virginia. And his interpretation of the Bible is that we have to rise up, take up arms, and slay the slave masters. That was his interpretation of the Bible. Other people have other interpretations of it. So when we say this is the last day, we have to consider where we've come from. I mean, look at the 17th century, the 15th, the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century. Millions of our people were being ripped away from the African continent. They died in the bowels of slave ships. They were thrown overboard. They came here. They suffered for centuries on enslavement. We still are here, and we're still prevailing. So can we say today is worse than it was in the 17th century as far as African people are concerned? I don't think so. That's just my interpretation of it.
Did you want to jump in? And then we'll come to you.
Why don't you go ahead and then
Are you sure? Oh, I'm sorry. My question is, one of the things that's been really important to those of us in Detroit right now, as the new generation, I guess, or the latest generation of those who believe in freedom, is we do have the benefit of understanding that we might be making history in some way, no matter how small. So one of the things I'm very concerned about, I always make a joke, which Professor Theoharis you might not like. I'm like, if they're gonna do me like they did Rosa, I'd rather not be remembered. And I mean that. Like, I'd rather be erased from history than to have my memory be something other than what I am. And I'm just wondering, what is it that we should be doing right now, or could be doing right now, to preserve our history and to ensure that when the story is told, there's a better chance of it being told correctly?
Okay. Well, the first thing I forgot to mention is that we've been doing these fundraisers to be able to give out copies of the young adult edition of the Rosa Parks book, and so we have some here today. So if people are educators or have friends who are educators, we adapted the book, I adapted the book with Brandy Colbert, sort of 12 and up. So I think the first thing is, I think sometimes there's this idea that we can't teach young people like the real history, and like you give them this like weird, watered down, distorted thing, and then if they get lucky enough to like get to college and get to take a like civil rights movement class, then it can be all corrected. And I think young people know better, so this is my skin in the game of that. But we have a whole box of books to give out. So people should, if you are an educator, if you know an educator, it's sort of, junior high, high school. I mean, the idea was, I think a lot of people then when if you get lucky, you get to learn like a fuller history in college, you're like, why? Yeah. You just feel ripped off, right? It's just like, why did I learn this? And so, and then to go back to my second point, or maybe the point I started with, which is, I think we have to, with Mrs. Parks, but just more broadly, I think one of the ways that we misteach and we mismemorialize the civil rights movement is by containing it to the South. And I think one of the struggles is to grapple with a movement that was in the South, in the Upper South, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, on the West Coast. And because I think if we're teaching that history, then there's more chance to be making the connections to today. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be distorted, but I think part of the issue is making it seem like this was a Southern problem, not a national problem. And so kind of, again, getting Mrs. Parks out, you know, in Montgomery, but also in Detroit.
I think, well, I've got two things that are right at the top of them. The first problem is teaching American history. What we want is real American history. And what they don't want is real American history for obvious reasons. Because they'll look bad. It's not a nice history. So I think just getting American history taught is one thing. In terms of the civil rights movement, I think we have a division now. There's like the good civil rights movement. There's the good SNCC, because there were white people in it. And then there's the bad civil rights movement, where, oh, and that's not even the civil rights, because, you know, oh, there was nonviolence, and then there was violence. And the violence, where people were destroying property in their neighborhoods, where we had made people rich, but it wasn't ours, it was theirs. And so the interpretation of the Black Power urban uprisings also needs to be addressed in the right terms. You know, one of the issues, again, in writing hands, was when I called, I wouldn't call the uprisings riots. The scholars, the civil rights scholars, wanted that change back to riot. And, you know, of course, didn't. And part of that is taking these earlier people like Mrs. Parks and Dr. King. If you go to the Dr. King, the King Monument, you would really think he was a fighter for all people. He wasn't. There's nothing there's not one quote on that monument that suggests that he is an advocate for Black people. Not there. And then if you have someone who's a clear advocate for Black people, well, he's bad. So there's a lot to do, and my favorite one that I'd like to get rid of is that, you know, Lincoln treat the slaves. We're gonna, you know, it's just so much. American history that needs to be taught appropriately.
Just to build on that, you know, we can talk about this too, but I think this is another part of why Hands on the Freedom Plow is such an important collection, because these are histories of the movement from the perspective of movement veterans. And what we know is that white supremacy is always going to use history as a weapon to try to maintain and enforce itself. That's what we see with these attacks on Black studies today that are coming in the wake of and in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd uprisings. And that battle becomes harder to win when there is more documentation of people's history from people's perspectives. And so I say that to suggest that collections like Hands on the Freedom Plow are vital for that, for ensuring that a people's history of the movement is documented. And in the current day, as you're asking about, Nikia, like making sure that movement histories are being documented and not being lost. We have so many people in this room who have stories that need to be told, need to be documented. Like I've worked with Ms. Moore and doing some of this in the back here and have learned so much from that because Ms. Moore recognized and others that like there's such great value in having those stories preserved, not just to learn from, but also as a weapon, as another arrow in the quiver, if we will, in continuing these struggles for Black liberation. So I think that's an important part of it as well, and something that I've learned from being taught by movement veterans, and particularly the discipline of Black studies. Do we have any more questions that folks wanted to ask? All right. Well, please, y'all, join me in thanking Professor Jeanne Theoharis, Ms. Martha Prescod, Noonan, and Ms. Dorothy Dewberry, Aldridge, who brought us together today.
Before we close out, I want to say that there are booklets on the table about the subjects that we're talking about now. Selma history in particular, and also what is on the monument. And I'm hoping that you'll go by the monument. The monument is at Trojan Street near 8 Mile and Greenfield. And we're hoping you'll go by, look at it, and read the information on the monument. Secondly, I want to personally thank the panelists that came and, as they say, use their time to come by to see us in Detroit. And we thank them for coming and spending their time. We give them We also want to thank Dr. Blackmer. He's another one that's very quiet about his contributions. But he has made the mistake of being smitten and bitten by the history of the civil rights movement, and we thank him for it, and we thank him for all that he does.